Howdy, y'all, and welcome to the Playmakers Corner podcast. I am your host for this episode, Kodey Stoffer, once again talking about season previews here. I wrapped up 5A last week and talked about some 4A and some 3A teams, obviously. So go ahead and check all of those out if you have not yet, where I do the full analysis of how they did last year, what their schedule looked like, and then jump into, some of the players that graduated in the class of 2023 that had impacts on team A, B, or C. And then I go ahead and talk about some returning playmakers and try and look ahead to this fall and talk about how they are going to be doing. You are stuck with me, listeners, for the next 6 episodes here. So you're just going to have to bear with me here before finding out all the information that Simon as well as Gideon have done on the teams of their regions and their interest as well. So all of that being said, I do have a bevy of teams here today that I'm going to be talking about. The teams that I will be discussing on this episode, a little out of order here, but primarily the league that involves Heritage, Broomfield, Aurora Central, Adams City, and then, the entirety of that northern league in 4A of Erie, Greeley West, Silver Creek, Centaurus, Gateway, and Monarch here. So I'm very excited. Well, Centaurus a little different, but very excited to talk about all these teams and what they did last year and, just kind of look ahead to this season. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about a team from Littleton, Colorado, and that is going to be the Heritage Eagles team. One that I severely underestimated after some young players really stepped up big time. And, they bit off some big bites to start this season against Mountain Vista and Arapahoe. Arapahoe, they do play every year for the Milk Jug. But, after losing to 2 5A squads, they would then bounce back and not lose another game until the eventual state champs for the league championship, mind you, in which they only lost by 4 points in that game at home. So that game was very intense. They would then go on to beat Mesa Ridge in the playoffs after having a bye, and then they would not have as much luck against the state champs in Broomfield, but there's still a lot to be happy about from last season. But let's talk about some of those guys that made it possible last season, starting with Noah Schoen, who was running the show on offense. He wasn't particularly great under center, but still threw more touchdowns than interceptions, had 737 yards, but he was electric on the ground, racking up 857 yards and 11 scores. You combine that with the stellar athlete of Zyreek Siegler, who had 761 rushing yards and, 288 receiving yards. They kept the boat afloat on offense, combining for 36 total touchdowns. Another guy who was, making plays was Esteban Marquez here. He was the second leading receiver in both yards and receptions, but also on the receiving end, led the team with 4 receiving touchdowns due to a great combination of speed and athleticism. Now, kind of shifting over to the defensive side of the ball here, William Sheft was a stud for this defense, doing a little bit of everything, forcing a fumble, recovering a fumble, 2 interceptions, 2 pass deflections, and was second on the squad with 80 tackles, 2 of those being in the backfield for loss. Now, second team All-State defensive end Cade Coons is going to be the big piece on this defense to replace here. Don't even know if you can really even say the word replace after posting 70 tackles and 12 of those going for loss, while also harassing the quarterback, getting 3.5 sacks and 5 hurries as well. There's a reason that he was second team All-State, and, he was somebody that we were trying to keep an eye on as well this past season. Isaiah Moore was another force to be reckoned with getting into the offense's backfield here. He had 5 tackles for loss on 68 total tackles and, also was, ranked 4th best in that department of tackles on this Eagles squad. Cornerback Brody Beeson notched 2 interceptions and 4 pass deflections on a heck of a defensive effort this past season. And then 4 of the top 6 tacklers do graduate, which isn't the best with Sheft, Coons, Moore, and Vander Veldheit. But this defense was partially successful due to depth last year. And, I think that's a great segue into talking about some of the returning playmakers, as two of them were Defensive Playmaker of the Year candidates in the fall of 2022 with Rex Guthrie and Nick Long. Guthrie, he's somebody who is a great safety. He runs a 4.43 speed, and there's really nothing on a football field that you can't ask him to do. From laying the wood and playing up in the box, leading this team in tackles with 106 and recording 6.5 of those for loss, and playing the ball exceptionally well with a team high 3 interceptions, and is somebody who can bait quarterbacks absurdly well and is a stalwart on this squad. However, not to be outdone is the guy closer to the line of scrimmage, Nick Long, who is terrorizing opposing offenses with absurd totals of 11 sacks and 15 tackles for loss, both leading the team while forcing hurries and drawing attention for his teammates to get sacks as well. One does maybe have to wonder if that impact will be lessened by Cade Coons' absence. So there will have to be someone stepping up to still penetrate the backfield. And I do think that they have that in the likes of, Lucas Madrid, who had 72 tackles and 8 tackles for loss. And, those are just a couple of guys of the top 13 tacklers. 8 are returning, and life still seems possible to make a living through this defense. Diego Reyes at cornerback notched a pick while breaking up 4 passes here, so he's somebody who's been tested throughout the air this season. And, somebody who maybe didn't have a huge impact but has potential for a big impact here is tight end Tanner Turch, who, only played 5 games but still ended up as the 3rd leader in yards for the Eagles, and also showing the ability to make really big plays as well. And we'll see if that's sustainable over the course of a season. But of course, the big question here, who is going to be replacing Noah at quarterback? And we believe that it is going to be the 6'4" QB Kurt Rossner, who we think is next in line to sling the rock at Heritage. And having seen him in offseason workouts, obviously not the same as in pads, but he does show the ability to, escape pressure, move around really well, and also, huck it down the field, right? So we'll see what his decision-making looks like as well once, he gets those pads on. But he is somebody to watch for this year and is a definite threat to make this Heritage offense even more lethal. Granted, there's a little bit more slack to pick up in some departments, and I don't know if he's the same rushing threat that Noah once was, but, I think that there are things that he could do really well. So, they went 7-3 last year. They did far better than I had projected them to do. So let's go ahead and take some time and look at their schedule for this coming year. Obviously, it's going to mostly look the same. They do open up against Mountain Vista at home, and then they play Arapahoe, I believe, in the new LPS Stadium. I am probably planning to go to that game here. So 2 5A opponents. Both of those teams are really, really good. They could probably contest them a little bit better than last year. I do think that they have probably the strongest chance that they've had in a half decade to potentially beat Arapahoe for the Milk Jug. But, I do think that they probably still start off 0-2 here before winning another 6-7 games in a row here. I think that they have a very high possibility of replicating that same season from a year ago. And then they get a chance to snap their losing streak against Broomfield that I think is a little bit more vulnerable this year than last year. They had some of the best players in state, but, more on Broomfield here in just a second. So everyone just hold their britches here. But I think that, if everything goes right, I don't think that they go undefeated, but I think that there's a chance that they beat Arapahoe and pull off the upset. And then there's a chance that they beat Broomfield this time around and could go 9-1. However, I think that 7-3 or 8-2 is more fair. So that makes their window of wins 7-9 here. And I do think that they're going to be way more of a player here at state. But I just need to see Kurt Rossner in action. I'm going to learn a lot from him. Maybe not so much in the Mountain Vista game. It could be a shootout of some kind. Mountain Vista is very, weapons heavy this year. But I think I'll learn a lot at that Arapahoe game, seeing how he combats that defense that is really good on all 3 levels. And, if he can remain patient and stay poised in that game against the Warriors, I think that this is a very strong team for that. And they will ride an incredibly hot win streak, I believe, heading towards Broomfield that last week of the season prior to the postseason. But let's let Broomfield do the talking for themselves. Last year's recap, what is there to say that doesn't need to be said here? It was a storybook ending for so many players and, concluded, in this fairy tale-ish way when the defense held up their end of the bargain this year. They got a defensive coordinator in there, they got some accountability, and they got some incredible playmaking and played some of the toughest football teams in the state. I mean, they opened up the season with a big win over Longmont, which, was eventually a playoff team. Holy Family, 3A, Vista Peak, 4A or whatever. But their statement win comes at home over Erie that they put it to 35-14. Coach V and I were at that game. The Broomfield crowd was just electric. The sidelines were electric. And there were so many players making plays for Broomfield that this year felt different. And Cole LaCrue was at the head of that with energy that was so contagious that you couldn't help but just get behind this guy. And so, they beat Brighton. They beat up on Dakota Ridge. I was at that game in the press box in the pouring rain. Mikhail Benner with 3 interceptions. I was like, okay, this team is great on both sides of the ball against 2 of the best offenses in 4A. They held them to a combined 38 points, which sounds like a lot, but it really isn't. And then they won the rest of their games, went undefeated in league, waited in the first round for Windsor, blanked them 42-0. Waited for Heritage, blanked them 46-0. I was a little surprised by that rematch. And then another rematch awaited them in Erie where they made a goal line stand against the hottest player in Colorado football at the time in Blake Barnett, who had been going on an absolute massacre through the playoffs here. And they stalled him out at the very last possible second here. And then they beat the Loveland Red Wolves from even further up north, a team that they had not previously seen in the season, and beat them by 10 points pretty convincingly, honestly. It never really felt like Loveland had a chance to win this game when watching it. So that was Broomfield's recap, but, it came with a very heavy senior toll here. This section is going to be brutal, but will be headlined by 3-year varsity starter Cole LaCrue, who played with a fire and physicality that defined, this Eagle squad and was a spark on their road to state. In 3 years, he threw for over 6,000 yards and 57 touchdowns, while notching another 1,549 on the ground, including an absurd high in rushing scores with 20 this past season, his senior year. The dual threat will be competing at Wisconsin for college ball and leaves a larger-than-life shoes as Colorado High School legend and the 4A Player of the Year award. Other guys who, provided some stability for this Eagles squad was Connor Tanner, who gave LaCrue clean pockets and a plethora of ball carriers open lanes and graduated after being nominated to the first team All-State squad. And then the only rusher ahead of quarterback Cole LaCrue was running back Luke Francis. He reached the 1,000-yard mark and added on 11 scores while providing a very consistent presence for the squad and arguably being the very foundation of this offense at 156 carries. But there's a lot of moving parts here. Ryland Beamer was another senior who almost had 100 carries, but still found the end zone 6 times and had 657 yards. And, made this backfield and wing-back-driven motion offense a pick-your-poison for opponents. And, for all the work that the run game did, Cannon Juarez and Kalen Frey were 2 seniors that combined for 65 receptions, 1,225 yards, and 12 touchdowns for this squad, being pretty even in all stat categories, and Juarez being someone who especially balled in the state title game and was dangerous in the pass game on defense as well, with 7 interceptions and 7 pass deflections. So Cannon Juarez, just really a stud, going both ways and being a skill position nightmare for opposing teams. Speaking of the defense, though, Big Dog 93 Garrett Keeler had a team-high 119 tackles at defensive end, while also a team-high 22.5 tackles for loss and 5 sacks, leaving not just a hole, but really a void on the defensive side of the ball. Devin Feroy, those numbers are solid at 49 tackles and, 1.5 for loss, but it understates his importance in clogging up lanes and making it extremely difficult to run up the middle on this squad. Combine that with the trio of seniors in Beamer, Holden Potter, and Nick Petrick, who all hovered between 50 and 60 tackles, with Petrick and Potter both having 5.5 TFLs apiece, and Petrick being especially troublesome as a defender with 5 cumulative turnovers. And those are some very high impact, high motor guys that you're losing on both sides of the ball. But I don't think it is time to panic. On top of this, I should also mention that they are without their coach from last year as well. So a little bit of a change of scene for the new head coach. That's somebody who's going to be, someone to watch and see how his scheme works. I believe that they're going to run basically the same offensive system and keep a lot of the same on-field kind of focuses and traits and qualities, but it will be interesting to see how it is enforced and carried out. But talking about the guys who need to carry it out, they returned the best corner in the state, who last season as a sophomore had 11 interceptions, 3 in one game against Dakota Ridge, and 6 pass deflections to go with it. If he adds even a little bit more discipline and, works on his footwork a little bit this offseason, he could be a top 10 recruit his senior year. Pretty easily, I would say, in Mikhail Benner. So that's a huge return. Brent Harris is a stud athlete who will be important to this team's success this year after racking up 5 interceptions, 8 pass breakups, fumble forced, fumble recovery, 48 tackles, and a team third best, 11 touchdowns with, 4 of those rushing and then catching 6 and a pick 6 as the cherry on top for someone who could potentially be the Eagles MVP this coming season. Speaking of finding pay dirt, we got to talk about leading receiver Anthony Cobb, who had 10 receiving scores his junior year on 40 total receptions and also put together 745 yards in a very crowded receiving corps and a very selfless kind of skill position group here. Noah Biller was someone who was asked to do a lot his junior year, and he rose to the occasion with a team's second best 91 tackles, also posting 2 pass deflections, a pick, and 3 fumble recoveries as a well-rounded defender who has plenty of supporting help to eclipse triple-digit tackles his senior year, I believe. Landon Davidson, he's a lineman who just committed to Nebraska this offseason and has only continued to get bigger and stronger and will be an absolute force once again on this offensive line. He will also be rejoined by rising junior Ty LaCrue, who is great at communicating up front and could benefit from an offseason of putting on some mass, and obviously has that LaCrue championship DNA flowing through his veins. Gio Toledo was a solid contributor on this defense with 50 tackles and some major stops, both in the regular season and the postseason. And the big question mark and the biggest shoes to fill and the most amount of pressure to answer to is junior quarterback C.T. Worley. Where is he at and is he ready? In limited action last season, he completed 80% of his passes and ended with 5 passing touchdowns to only 1 interception and added on a rushing touchdown on varsity while putting together some very solid performances through JV, looking quite dominant on both the ground and the air. He could benefit by picking his feet up a bit more as a runner on the varsity level, but he's been waiting for this day for quite some time now. I've been watching him work out and, been to workouts involving him since his freshman year. He's only gotten bigger. He's only filled out more. And, he has the confidence to run this offense and to lead this team to success. But a lot of eyes are going to be on him. And, it's going to be on. It's going to be really real here. And, I think that he's going to be a great quarterback, but he's also one of the best fits for this offense that, really complements his game well. And I think his game fits the scheme. And, looking at the schedule, it's not going to be like last year. They're not going to only allow 9 points per game through the regular season as a defense, or at least I don't think so. As an offense, they're not going to be putting up bonker, numbers and stat lines. I mean, over 14 games last year, they were averaging 40.9 points per game. I don't think it's going to be that level of success this year. I think that there are a couple of question marks in very key places. I'm looking mostly between the headset and, Like I said, I believe in CT, but he's got to show it on a consistent season-long basis this coming season. So the pressure's on, but the schedule I think it's favorable. Longmont, I think that this is a game that you should probably win if you're Broomfield again, if I'm being completely honest. Not to say anything about Longmont. They're going to have a lot of rising talent. They're going to look for a reason to prove themselves this year, but you got to shut that down week 1. Holy Family, that's a 3A team returning a lot of talent. I think it's going to be more competitive than last year, but this Broomfield squad should be bigger up front and find success that way. Vista Peak Prep definitely should win this game. Erie, that might be a great revenge game for the Tigers here. And, I'll talk about them a little bit on this episode later, but very, very quality team returning a lot of very key pieces. I'm probably going to chalk that one as a loss, especially seeing that it is in Erie. Now, Brighton, that's a game that they should definitely win. Dakota Ridge, lots of moving parts there. I think they could probably win this game, but I will, that's going to be a window of win kind of coin toss game. Aurora Central, Adam City definitely should win these games. Fruita Monument, solid, but I think you should still probably win this game. And, Heritage. So I'd say the only games that I think they could lose are Erie, Dakota Ridge, Heritage. So, I'll say a window of wins of, they should still probably win 7 games here. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'll say like a window of wins of 6 to 8. I say that maybe they, get pinched twice this regular season here. But, I could see them I don't think I see them going undefeated in any world. But 8-2, I think is going to say that's going to be my final record for the Broomfield Eagles, with a lot of returning pieces, but also a lot of new faces. And, I will say that repeating is always hard, especially when Colorado legends graduate and the head coach is replaced. There are question marks, but with the amount of returning talent, this team, there's no excuse to not make the postseason, but they will, I'd say, have one of the better chances of repeating on the 4A level that we've seen in some time. That's what I honestly think, and I am very excited to see this team this season and might make it out to the Erie game. We'll see. It's on a Saturday, so maybe that's favorable for us here. But another team in this league is not one that really was in their bag this last season here. I'm talking about the Adams City Eagles. They were kind of all over the place. They were narrowly beating 4A teams. They were getting rocked by teams 3A through 5A and getting sent to one of the tougher leagues in 4A with multiple contenders, including the eventual state champs, did not help. They lose their first 2 against North Glen and Riverdale before beating Hinckley and Skyview, and then getting throttled by a very good Northfield team, but, wins a narrow one against Aurora Central and then closes the season with 4 straight losses to very good teams. But, talking about some seniors who graduated, Levi DeGuero graduates after being the leading rusher and passer for this squad. 7 touchdowns through the air, 7 touchdowns through the ground. He was pretty inefficient at quarterback and turned the ball over pretty significantly. But, all 3 of the other guys who were threats in the backfield and ran for scores all graduated as well. 2 of the 3 receivers who had a touchdown reception and over 100 yards also graduated. No crazy numbers, but still, experience is experience, I guess, on this level. The top 4 tacklers all graduate in Jackson Lopez, Levi again, Yogi Vargas, and Seth DeGuero. They also all led in tackles for loss with 8 combined. Seth led with 8 tackles for loss, just ahead of Levi and Jackson, who had 7 apiece. And then Seth was the leading pass rusher on the squad with 5 sacks. Now, Levi, DeGuero, and then Micah Ortiz went crazy, recovering 3 fumbles apiece, and Jackson had 2 himself while also forcing 2 fumbles as well. Not sure if he recovered the same ones that he forced, but, that's a lot of turnovers going out the door. I mean, that's 8 just between those 3 players. And then Mekhi Wright, who also had the most interception yards on just 1 interception, is graduating, taking across the stage 46 tackles as well. So lots of very key defensive players leaving this Adams City squad here. Now, the leading receiver of the squad, Ricardo Hernandez, had 5 receiving touchdowns and 219 yards. He was the primary source of big plays for this offense. He'll be returning. Adrian De La O was easily the brightest spot of this season with a nice 3 interceptions, a pass deflection as a freshman, and maybe tasked with even more on both sides of the ball heading forward. Michael Victoria was the only non-senior to crack the top 7 in total tackling at the number 5 spot with 48 tackles, but a lot more of those total tackles coming from assisted tackles. Abel Albaron, as a junior on the defensive line, had 4 tackles for loss, but didn't collect an overwhelming amount of total tackles. And then sophomore Brody Burke had 2 tackles for loss in 3 games played and also scooped up a fumble for a 25-yard return. So, in short, I think that this season is going to be a rough one. I think that they don't beat this North Glen team. This Riverdale Ridge team could be a toss-up game, but I just don't see enough offensive production to really believe that. Hinckley, they should beat Hinckley. Skyview could potentially win that game. They are returning some pretty solid pieces to, this squad. And, they're returning like their leading rusher. They're returning like their leading quarterback and receivers. So I think that Skyview probably actually wins this game against Adams City. Northfield, I just assessed this team yesterday on Sunday the 9th, and they're returning a lot of pieces, so I don't think that they beat Northfield. Aurora Central, I'm going to talk about this team here in a bit. They graduated even more talent, and that was after a struggling season, so maybe they could beat Aurora Central for the second year in a row with all the defensive pieces that they have coming back. But then against Heritage Broomfield, even Golden and Fruita Monument, I just don't have a lot of faith in them. So I think that at worst, you beat Hinckley and Aurora Central. Maybe you beat Riverdale Ridge. So I'm going to give this team a window of wins of 1 to 3 for this upcoming season, unless they just have a bunch of one-year starters that play their socks off on the offensive side of the ball. That's what would have to happen for the Eagles to be a bit more competitive out of Commerce City here. But at least with returning players, they have a path to success versus this Aurora Central Trojan squad who very much underperformed compared to my expectations. Even though they were returning a lot, I guess that the major difference was losing Marcus Howard, the senior who just 2 years ago was a top 5 edge rusher and also was the leading sack artist in the state of Colorado, went on to commit to Northern Colorado and whatnot. That made a huge difference to this defense that was allowing 25.9, basically 26 points per game. And I guess that the writing was probably on the wall when you look at the fact that they lost to Northfield, who was in their very first season of 3A. This was supposed to be a layup win, looking at the pieces that they were returning, but it was not. They did bounce back with a win against Hinckley that they were supposed to, and then a pretty big win, I'd say, against Falcon on the road. I think that was very important before losing a 7-point game to Rangeview. Not good. I mean, at this point, even against a Northfield team that was very talented, they should still be 3-1 heading into this 3A matchup with George Washington. This was a very good George Washington team that they lost to, which is fine. But then losing to Adams City, I mean, oh my goodness, I just don't get how they did it with the offensive firepower that they had at the ready. But Broomfield brought it, Fruita brought it, Heritage brought it, and then they scored 75 points, I guess, against Thornton, which... Oh, I'm being disrespectful, I'm not going to lie. But, oh my God, that's a lot of freaking points, don't you think? I am not sure if this box score is entirely accurate, to be fair. That it seems a little bit absurd, especially considering the struggles that they had the rest of the season. But this game pretty drastically impacts the averages of the points scored, the total points. Like, even if this really is true, this is a flash in the pan that they just were not capable of keeping consistent throughout the entire year. And so let's talk about a lot of the pieces that they're losing, which is not good news. Like, some teams struggle and they graduate players, and, it's a chance for, these younger players to get in and breathe anew. This is bad news because the heavy load on Cyrese Kirby and Simeon Beasley will be no more. After multiple years of being the anchors of the offense, they will both graduate along with their quarterback Portillo. Beasley was also solid on defense at a linebacker position, and Kirby doubled as a corner/safety for the squad and was voted as the special teams player of the year in this league. In this league, with, once again, Broomfield, Heritage, and Fruita being all very solid playoff teams, he won special teams player of the year because he's that much of a threat anytime the ball is kicked to him to house it. He was that much of a threat anytime he was handed off the ball, and he was that much of a threat anytime they could potentially scheme him open. This quarterback held this offense back pretty significantly, though, I would say. And then Juan Cooper, he was disruptive for the Trojans and will be graduating. Senior linebacker Brandon Weatherford crosses the stage after a couple of productive seasons, getting some time his junior year as well. Trevon Simmons-Adams got carries this past season, but was better at burying ball carriers and getting to the quarterback. And then Lorenzo Johnson, just a couple years ago, was an All-State honorable mention guy, and he was important to paving holes for the offense in the ground game and could also clog up lanes as a defensive lineman. Now, some of the guys who are coming back, something to maybe be a little bit optimistic about, is rising senior Andrew Harris, who pieced together a solid 45-tackle campaign his junior year while getting an interception and batting some passes while he was at it. And then Chris Perkins was chosen as a member of the second-team All-League squad due to some of the big plays he was capable of making. Now, I'm not enthused for this 2023 season, if I'm being completely honest, because they lost so much, and they didn't even win that many games with the good talent that they did have, so I can only assume that this season is somehow going to be worse. I think that Northfield, they probably lose to. Hinckley, haven't looked into them too much, but they seem to just be the doormat here on the 4A, 5A level. Falcon, they probably don't win that game. I know that they were a little bit on the younger side last year, but they're going to be filling out, and they probably start off 1-2 here. Rangeview, I'm not 100% on, but it'll be a win a bowl game, I should say. But, they had some young contributors, but they also had older athletes on both sides of the ball, so that game should be interesting, at least determining, this kind of like Aurora crown or whatever. George Washington, G-Dub graduates a lot of talent. A lot of talent. But they're also returning some, but they have unknowns at the coaching staff level. So I'll call that one a coin toss, but I'm leaning G-Dub. I think that Adams City probably wins this game against AC, but I'll at least call it a coin toss before they lose 3 games in a row. And then Thornton, who knows? They graduated some really good, or at least solid contributors for their squad last year. So, I think that's something to keep in mind. I don't think it'll be, if that score is accurate, I don't think it'll be that score this year. So we're saying at bare minimum, they probably win Hinckley. And then between Rangeview, Adams, and Thornton, they probably win a second game. At best, they beat Hinckley, obviously. And I think that they beat, at best, of course, Rangeview, G-Dub, Adams, and Thornton. So a window of wins of 2 to 5, I guess, is what I would say. But even that's a bit ambitious. So I'm going to say a window of wins of 2 and 4. I think that at best they go 4 and 6 unless they just have incredible studs step up. But they weren't doing a good job of keeping track of stats last year, which is not like a winning environment or a positive environment to be a part of. So, we'll see what happens. But this is a tough league that they were put in compared to the one that they were in the year before with Vista Peak Prep and D South and whatnot. So, and this schedule, this non-league schedule, will have some coin tosses and opportunities for sure. But they're going to need some stability, and they're going to need a lot of discipline here to weather this kind of slump that they stumbled into after making the postseason just 2 years ago. But this next team is for serious here, and, started off as one of our preseason favorites, but did not open up like one. And that is the Erie Tigers, who last season started off 2 and 4, losing to other 4A contenders in Pondo, Montrose, and Broomfield as a part of those losses, and Loveland. 2 of those teams obviously made it to state. One of those teams was a bye week, or 2 of those other 2 teams were bye week teams. So, very tough. Tested themselves right out the gate. But, after stumbling out with that and, inconsistent offense, porous defense, they turned it around and they gathered some steam winning against Monarch, Silver Creek, Longmont, Greeley West to win their league, and then in the playoffs, put it to Air Academy 49-7. And, entered the postseason at 6-4, but then pulled off back-to-back crazy upsets against Denver South, 35-10. That game wasn't really close at all, and they won that on the road in Denver's house on a Friday night. Then they beat Ponderosa on a Saturday afternoon. I was actually at that game, and it was incredible. It was a huge comeback from Erie here. They did not look like they were in good shape. There was a little bit of infighting, a little bit of, finger pointing, I would say. And, it was, I don't know, it did not seem like a good situation as they were down 25-8 at half. But then in the third quarter, they scored 4 touchdowns and they shut out Ponderosa for the rest of the game. And, well, good night. That's over with. That's all she wrote for the Ponderosa Mustangs that season before losing to Broomfield in the state semis. So, obviously, they were feeling themselves. They were trying to make state for the second year in a row. They played 14 total games and went 9-5, which is just a marathon of a season. But they did so with incredible poise, I would say, in the postseason. There were times where it didn't look good, but they were able to rally it back together, and this coach kept this team together and kept them focused on their goals, and I think that they came very, very close to it. I think that they came, obviously semis. That's a good place to be, especially considering how the season started. So let's talk about some of the guys that made it possible who were in that class of 2023. One of the first ones is Logan Gilmore, a trenches guy who contributed on both sides of the ball and will be graduating this offseason and playing college rugby, if I remember correctly. I want to say he was either in contention or was a top 5 senior position guy. Derek Hall was the leading tackler on the squad with 89 total tackles, while also recording 2 interceptions and batting 2 passes. Jace Onstad was second on the team with 4 sacks and 73 total tackles, while finding his way into the backfield a few times. Elijah Tolliver, had tackles for loss to the tune of 3 times. And then on the offensive side of the ball, they do lose for sure a PMC top 5 wide receiver in Caden Lettuce. He's committed to play at Southern Utah with his big frame and blazing speed. He was an absolute beast, leading this team in receptions at 44, yards with 935, and 11 touchdowns with great tackle breaking ability, and it will be very difficult to replace this receiver and competitor with the frame and strength that he was able to display. Additionally, Trey Kana was a great offensive weapon in his first full season as a starter with 1,158 all-purpose yards, rushing for 813 and catching for another 250 while accumulating 13 total touchdowns. So pretty significant amount of scoring here, 24 touchdowns between Lettuce and Kana on that defensive side, and then losing some size and grit on the defensive side of the ball is, quite a tall task here. But man, do they have some absolute beasts returning this fall. Headlined by one of the biggest names in Colorado football for the past 4 years. And it's crazy to think that Blake Barnett will be heading into his senior season already committed to Kansas State. With his commitment out of the way, this might open up his ability to focus on football and do his thing this season. In 3 seasons that have included a COVID season, he has scored the football 104 times through 45 rushing scores and 59 passing touchdowns. He's got solid arm strength, but an incredible knack of keeping plays alive. He was asked to mature quite a bit over the course of this season that tested Barnett and the Tigers more than ever, and he played incredibly during their 7-game win streak. That included the postseason. And now, with a state appearance and a semifinals appearance, Barnett and the Tigers appear in the ideal spot to make that final step to greatness. Speaking of tools that are going to help them achieve that, sophomore stud Gavin Lusk came in with the second most carries on the squad and finished with 11 rushing touchdowns on a very solid 6.5 yards per carry and should make the tailback transition the easiest it's been since Caleb Tyson took over. Another sophomore back, Ronan Ward, ran for 3 scores and was 4th on the team with 242 receiving yards for 3 scores through the air as well, making for a very effective multi-purpose offensive weapon. Second leading receiver, Kodey Meredith, had 379 yards and 3 receiving scores and will be looking to assume wide receiver 1 duties this season. Tight end Mason Cowgill poses matchup problems with his height and was effective, catching 4 touchdowns and could make this offense virtually unstoppable in the red zone if the Tigers feel encouraged throwing jump balls his way. Braylon Tolliver was solid with 180 rushing yards his freshman year, but he shined brightest in the postseason with a dominant performance over the Ponderosa Mustangs on the defensive side of the ball and ended the season with 3 interceptions, which was also tied for the team lead. Preston Terranova also shined very bright in that Ponderosa game, collecting 2 interceptions and 2 pass deflections that contributed to his totals of 3 and 5 on the year, respectively. Dylan Firebaugh was only a sophomore when he tied Terranova for the team lead in pass deflections this season and brings one of those down, giving the Tigers the ball with an interception. Another class of 2025 dog is Christian Hageman, who is 3rd on the team with 52 total tackles and was 2nd on the team in tackles for loss. This was second only to Washington State commit Jackson Cowgill here, who had 7 tackles for loss, but even more impressively, played like a man on fire, rushing quarterbacks with 11 sacks and being a huge catalyst for this defense that was young, but eventually got their life together, which is huge for a Tiger squad that brings back 7 of their top 9 tacklers. Now, last year, they were a younger team that grew up significantly over the course of the season and now bring back a senior and junior heavy, experienced postseason squad that played an insane 14 games, having had to go through the first round last season and having gotten a taste of state just a couple years ago in semis. They have to be starving for a state championship this year. And, this schedule is once again going to prepare them very much so for a run like that. Now, they do open up the season with a very interesting matchup against Vanguard here. Vanguard is a squad from out of state. This is a Florida squad, so I think that this is only going to strengthen them this season, considering the fact that Vanguard in their fall 22 season went 8-4 and eventually lost in the playoffs, but not until winning a playoff game. So they're going to get to test themselves against an out-of-state squad here with, different talent and everything like that. So that's going to be a huge test for them. And it's going to be a toss-up. I think that they bully Mullen this year. Montrose, I think that that's tough because they do have to go to Montrose, which is always such a long drive and is going to prove to be difficult as they do run that very annoying but effective system. So they'll have that going against them. Broomfield this year, they get to play at home. I think that this is a game that they win. I think that they beat Windsor on the road. I think that they beat Loveland at home this year, actually. But I think that it's still going to be a close game and one that Loveland could win before I think that Monarch probably pushes them a little bit more this year. Silver Creek, I think that they should probably beat Silver Creek, Longmont, and Greeley West. So let's just assume the worst case scenario for Erie this year, since I didn't really account for that last year, and say that they lose to Vanguard, Montrose, one of the two of Broomfield or Loveland. I don't think that they lose to both. And then maybe get upset. No, I'm not even going to go that far. I'm going to say that they win at least 7 games, with losing potentially to Montrose, Broomfield, Loveland, Vanguard, or Monarch. I think that they lose at most 3 out of 5 of those games. I think that's very fair to say. But I think that there is a world where they do win all of those games and maybe just lose to a team like Vanguard or a team like Montrose. So I'm going to say a window of wins of 7 and 9. I'm leaning towards 9-1, but they have shown that they can get off to a slow start to start the year, and they don't have quite the receiving threat that Caden Lettuce was. So I think that is something to keep in mind for this pass game to get going. So I think that, that's a very fair prediction for the Tigers, but, they easily, I think pretty easily, should be the favorites for 4A this coming season. Now let's go ahead and talk about the Greeley West Spartans, who snapped an extensive losing streak that dated all the way back to 2019 with an opening game win against Mountain Range before a brutal schedule broke this team down before claiming back a win over Greeley Central 14-6 and then ending their season with only one more touchdown in the last 3 weeks. So, let's talk about some of the contributors from this 2022 season. Jose Salas was the guy for the Spartans as somebody who is a great athlete and saw playing time as early as his sophomore year. He reassured that capability with a 78 tackle, 2 forced fumble, 595 yard, and 6 touchdown season, instilling confidence hopefully in this incoming 2024 squad that has plenty of talent and will just need to piece it together. Also graduating is another defensive stud in Ricardo Castillo, who had 4 tackles and 3.5 for loss, and also played very heads up, forcing 3 fumbles, recovering 4 fumbles, and notching a 62-yard interception as well. I remember when he first started to see the field, and he only got bigger and stronger since then, which is huge. But this 2024 class, it's crazy to think that my very first season doing Playmakers Corner, I was also coaching here at Greeley West, so I'm very familiar with these players, and I know that they're talented, but, situation of the school being rebuilt, as well as, trying to put it all together in a very tough season and schedule is going to be quite the challenge. So, Jermaine Amaya here, he may have been 4th in total tackles with 55, but he led the squad in tackles for loss at 6 while recovering 3 fumbles and also batting down passes. Ever since being illuminated to how fun contact is, he has come a long way and will be a great piece of a front line that should be lethal here. He's joined by fellow senior Cole Knorr, who has been seeing varsity action since freshman year and showed some chops with 5.5 sacks and 4 tackles for loss, while I assume still having offensive line responsibilities. So conditioning will be integral for this Spartans roster this season. You also get back the 6'1", 220-pound linebacker / running back David Lopez, who's another guy who's been seeing varsity action since freshman year. And, he showed it this past season with a second best 75 tackles and 5 for loss while getting some carries as well. Beefing up and hitting conditioning, he could be one of the best 2A players in league, which is saying something in this league. Tyler Vale was somebody who had 2 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks, and 24 total tackles in his junior year, and is a fiery player with great reach for keeping offensive linemen off of him up front. Jacob Flores is the only player returning to the secondary with interceptions and will have to be a leader in this defensive secondary for an aspect that was weaker on this team last season. And then the big question will be under center after Julian Salas was wildly inefficient with 14 interceptions and kept this team out of games. Whoever takes over or is at quarterback needs to be dedicated. They need to watch film. Otherwise, this will be another very subpar year for Greeley West, who, it doesn't get easier for. Look, Mountain Range, this is a team that, obviously struggled last year as well, losing to this squad here in Greeley West. And I think that they're another team that, I think that they're returning a lot of defensive guys, but, on offense, it'll be interesting to see who they have starting at quarterback. So I think that this is possibly a winnable game. Bear Creek, absolutely not. Thomas Jefferson, I don't think so. Northridge graduated a lot of players, but, just from a program stability perspective, I would still probably lean towards Northridge here. Silver Creek, no. Longmont, no. Greeley Central, yes. Maybe. Actually, it won't be as easy as last year, and last year was tough. So that's coin toss. Windsor, no. Monarch, no. Erie, no. So at best, you beat Mountain Range, you beat Northridge maybe, and you beat Greeley Central. At worst, you lose all 3 of those games, and you literally go 0-10 this year. I don't think that happens. I think that they probably go 2-8 again, if I'm being 100% honest. It's not so much them, so much as it is a lot of these other teams are just also returning a ton of seniors, which is kind of crazy because I felt like doing previews for the 2022 season, a lot of teams were graduating very senior-heavy teams, and it just didn't feel like that this year as far as contributors and playmakers for a lot of other squads. So I'm going to say 0-3 window of wins for Greeley West this season, due in huge part to strength of schedule. But huge shout out to my guys, that I got to coach there. And there's no lost love here. I'm obviously rooting for you guys. I want you to do well. And, I would love more by y'all than anyone else in the state to be proven wrong by y'all. Keep those GPAs up, get your homework turned in, and go ahead and, ball out this season. Keep pumping that iron in the weight room. And hopefully this coach here can lead y'all guys to a promising send-off, a proper send-off for that class of 2024. But let's go ahead and move on and talk about the Silver Creek Raptors, where, it feels appropriate to say that, they won the games they were supposed to and lost games to teams that were just better. It just stinks to see them drop both of their Longmont contests this past year, but a junior-heavy Silver Creek from last year returns a lot of talent and has a chance to really make a postseason push. Last year, they beat Prairie View, lose to Golden. Beat Boulder, lose to Frederick. Beat Greeley West, lose to Skyline, Longmont, Erie. Beat Greeley Central, and then lose to Monarch to close the season. And, that's tough. But, let's talk about the seniors who are graduating before we jump into a pretty solid section of returning players. Luke Riders and Birch Neild both had over 300 yards, but Neild's ability to find pay dirt will be sorely missed after catching 9 touchdowns, which was half of the total receiving touchdowns on this squad. Combine this with another 2 scores from Lange, and this senior presence in the receiving core was strong, breaking the plane for 6 points at a time here. Lots of scores to be replaced. Maddox Schaefer was the only all-state caliber player, apparently, playing for the honorable mention list and leading this team in total tackles at 66 and trumped every other player in tackles for loss at 11, which was as much as the next 4 dudes combined. Speaking of the next 4 dudes here and the 5th one, they were all seniors with multiple tackles for loss and a bunch of tackles with Riders. Neild's name appearing again, both with 60-plus tackles. Evan Horton was 3 tackles for loss deep and a 60-tackle guy. Defensive lineman Vaughn Lee only had 37 total tackles, but his 3 for loss were amongst the best. And then Patty Fay was another defensive lineman who notched multiple tackles for loss and a couple of sacks combined with 5 hurries. This batch of players was also responsible for 6 of the team's 8 forced fumbles and 8 of the fumble recoveries, with Schaefer being a menace rushing the quarterback with 5.5 sacks and 13 hurries as categories that he led the squad in. Third on the team in total tackles was senior Jonah Strebel, and then absolute stud senior Aiden Helm was dominant in the air with 5 interceptions and another 11 pass deflections, doing the absolute most for this secondary and leaving a monumental void. So this defense is learning serious talent up front and in the secondary to, kind of summarize it here for, the Raptors squad. But let's go ahead and keep chugging along here and talk about some of the good things that will be returning. Some of the players here that are going to be in charge of keeping this defense at the rate of turnovers that they were capable of last season will be rising junior efforts from Roland Varga and Paul Hudson Adini, who both had an interception apiece, and Varga had a team second best for pass deflections. They'll be looked at to replace about 70% of the total interceptions that graduated this past season. Russell Meinke also had an interception and 3 pass deflections and will be looking to help with that. Bubba Fisk will be the senior to try and patch 6 of the top 7 tacklers graduating as the lone non-senior who had 65 tackles but was not getting a ton of those for loss, which was something kind of common for this defensive unit. Joko Vitamong and Ibrahim Kabor will be tasked with filling some big shoes up front after combining for 44 tackles amongst the two of them. But while the defense will probably take a step back, this offense has me much more excited as a unit that should take massive strides forward, after rising seniors quarterback Eli Myers was solid with 18 touchdowns to 7 picks on almost 60% completion efficiency and was a single yard away from 1,600 through the air. Cole Rogers was also a stud in the backfield, keeping this offense balanced, rushing for 945 yards on a 5.2 yards per carry and scoring a solid 14 rushing touchdowns and competency out of the backfield with the team third best 27 receptions for 300 yards and another score. They'll have a complimentary sophomore tailback returning in David Tan, who only had 6 games to show his stuff, but was efficient enough at 4.1 yards per carry and ripping off one of the longest runs of the Raptors season with a 55-yarder. Bubba Fisk also appears to be the marquee target on offense with a solid 396 yards on 39 receptions and 3 scores. So let's go ahead and take a look at the schedule this fall. Like I said, the defense is probably taking a step back, which is not good for teams that are returning a ton of talent on offense, but provides opportunities otherwise for teams that are maybe a bit younger on the defensive side of the ball. Prairie View, this is a winnable game. Golden, I actually think that this is a game that they could potentially win this year. I would be a lot more excited. I don't think it's going to be the same blowout that it was last year. Boulder, they should absolutely win this game. Frederick is graduating a lot of players, honestly, but at the same time, I do think that they are, a solid enough program, and, I think that they're going to have a few issues, especially if they come in and underestimate them, which I think is something that might have happened last year. So, I think that's something to consider, and they are returning some playmakers. But I think that they should win this game, if I'm being honest. Greeley West, they should win this one. Skyline, this is a game that they should probably win since they have more returners on offense. But I think that this is potentially going to be a shootout. Longmont, this game could go either way, but I think that Silver Creek probably has its best chance to take back the town of Longmont this year. I think if they lose this Skyline game, then they definitely win this Longmont game. But, if they win the Skyline game, Longmont could go either way. They don't beat Erie. They don't beat Greeley Central. And Monarch is an interesting one with a ton of returning playmakers on both sides of the ball. They might be a little bit more balanced. So I think that they might lose this game to Monarch. But let's say at worst they win Prairie View, they win Boulder, they win Greeley West, they win one of the 2 Longmont games. I mean, that's already got you up to 4 or 5. So I think that the floor of this team at least should be, 5 wins. But I think that they could really string together a very positive season here. If they beat Prairie View, Golden, Boulder, Frederick, Greeley West, Skyline, and Longmont, they could be entering Erie with a 7-game win streak and then hopefully only lose to Monarch, making their window of wins 5 to 8. I do think that 6-4 is probably the most likely record for this team, but I think that Silver Creek should be making a return back to the postseason this year. And, I think it'd be very interesting to have a different team run Longmont each year for the past 3 years, narratively speaking. So I'm kind of excited for that, but the Trojans are going to be a tough out. But I think the Raptors will be an even tougher out this year for either of the other Longmont teams. But now we will talk about the Centaurus Warriors, who rode one of the easiest schedules in the state to a 500 record last year. Having competed in the I-25 league, this league is meant for struggling programs, and they ended up with, a solid season and a winning record in league. So, I think that it's the non-league teams that they struggled against and, got their tail handed to them a few times, but otherwise played in a handful of competitive games. They lost to Boulder at the beginning year by 6 points. I think that they probably should have won that game, or later in the season they would have won that game. Then they pull off a very close win against Mountain Range. They lose to Monarch, but within 4. Take care of business against Hinckley and Palmer before, losing to Mountain View. And then in league, only losing to Liberty and Widefield. Widefield being the, team that represented that league in the postseason. And then beating Thornton and Gateway. So, a little bit of a mixed bag, obviously, such as the I-25 league kind of life is. But, there were some solid class of 2023 guys here to help, such as Ethan Roeder, who strung together a very positive season, recording 42 receptions, which was more than the next 3 leading receivers combined. a very nice 586 yards, and 4 receiving scores, being a model of reliability throughout this past season. While not having the most receptions this past year, they do lose 6'4" tight end and red zone threat in Zach Woj-Talik, who found the end zone 3 times on only 10 receptions in 7 games played. And that being said, he was heavily utilized and leaned on in the defensive aspect at end, leading this team in tackles for loss and being tied for the lead in sacks, and by far establishing himself as the best pass rusher on the squad with all the hurries that he had collected as well. A lot of players got turns scoring out of the backfield, with almost everyone who notched a carry finding the end zone, but Ryan Tran did it at a clip of 7 yards per carry, which was the best for any ball carrier over 30 carries and a team's second best 5 rushing touchdowns. And then between Ryan Tran and Senley Kning, they were both in the top half in tacklers of those who notched double-digit tackles, and Kning was in the backfield quite often. Now, for returning playmakers, returning to the fold will be Benjamin Mishke, who I think will be the focal point of this offense after rushing for over 100 yards in 6 games en route to an 1191-yard season, scoring a team-high 8 rushing touchdowns. And if he can step forward as a receiver, this is a solid player to keep eyes on. Jack Parana and Adisu McCormick were both non-seniors who had 3 rushing scores per person, with Parana finding the 212 total yards and McCormick making the most of his 4 games played and 11 carries. So both of those showing big play capability in a variety of ways. Chance Wood is, I think, the big one to look out here for. He is coming back as a quarterback. He posted 1,218 yards and threw 11 touchdowns, but also turned the ball over plenty with 9 interceptions and has to get rid of those mistakes to win the games that ended in close losses last season. I'm talking Skyline, where they only lose by 7. I'm talking Monarch, where they lose by 10. I'm talking Frederick, where they lose by 2. Those are all very winnable games. Even if you flip only one of those, you might make the postseason in 4A with the strength of this schedule. I digress. Let's keep talking about some of the guys who are coming back. In the secondary, a sophomore by the name of John Krupe had 3 interceptions in 5 recorded games, showing a knack for playmaking that the Warriors will be glad to have back for both this season and next season. You also got senior defender Alexander Wold, who had a solid 4 pass deflections and a forced fumble to go with his interception. And then sophomore Gage Mutz was tested somewhat often, resulting in a team best tie for 5 pass deflections. And then Renzo Washak and Xavier Bradford Valentine return and will assumingly continue to hot quarterbacks and ball carriers after both showing that they can get to the quarterback and notch tackles for loss at an efficient rate. So Centaurus, let's go ahead and take a look at this 2023 schedule. I believe that they're still in that I-25 league. So, it's going to be much the same. They start off the season away at Boulder. This is probably a game that they win this year. Mountain Range, I like their odds of winning that. I think that they probably lose to Monarch again before beating Hinckley and Palmer, starting off with another 4-1 start. And then against Mountain View, I'm not 100% positive on that one, so we'll call it a coin flip. Liberty, I think that was a flash in the pan, if I'm being completely honest. I think that they probably beat this Liberty team this year, and then they beat Thornton and Gateway. They do not beat Whitefield. They do not win this league, and the strength of schedule, I don't think, even with a projected record of, 6-4 or 7-3, I just don't think it's enough for this team with this schedule. And so, that's what I'm going to say is that their window of wins, I think that they're between 5 to 7 for this year. I think that the strength of schedule helps them out pretty significantly. No chance that they beat Monarch. I really don't give them a chance to beat Whitefield. And I think that they drop another one of these games against the likes of maybe a Mountain View or maybe a Mountain Range. So I think that they could go 7-3 really this season. But hopefully no worse than 6-4. But, I'd like to keep that window of wins a little bit wider. I only did 2-win window of wins last year, and it didn't pay off for me all that often. So we're going to go ahead and say for the Warriors here of Centaurus, 5-7 window of wins. Now we get to talk about the Olympians here out of Gateway. Last season, they had first-year coach Rico McCoy, whose first order of business seemed to just be to stabilize this program. As, they had a a pretty crazy 5 forfeits just to start the season. And, they got worked by Widefield and then forfeit to Denver South before capturing their first win since the spring of 2021 with a 40-point dub over Hinckley and then losing to Palmer and Centaurus, but put up 19 points per game in those contests, and one hopes that they'll be eligible, strong, and ready to compete again this fall. Now, for the class of 2023 at Gateway, there were 3 seniors who all ran for over 100 yards, and Brian Godinez, David Anderson, and Devontae Meadows, who all graduate, with Meadows and Anderson finding touchdowns. And then also, Godinez and Anderson pairing led the squad in total tackles with 41 and 39 respectively, and both having a knack for getting into the backfield, with Anderson also being a force through the air defense attack here, having 2 interceptions and then a fumble recovery to spark some life on this defense. Devontae Meadows was also tied for the team lead in sacks with 5, along with fellow senior Ethan Brenneschultz here, with Ethan actually leading the team in tackles for loss with 7, leaving some voids in the defense up front. Then William Pope Walls had 32 tackles and 4 for loss his senior season at a backer position, and overall the Olympians graduate 6 of their top 13 tacklers. As for returning playmakers, they do have Niall Sorrell, who is an absolute beast for them, putting up a Herculean effort to score with this offense, throwing 3 scores to 2 picks, but as a rusher, ripping off a long of 92 in a season that saw him rush for 548 yards and 11 touchdowns, while also balling out on the defensive side of the ball with 2 interceptions, being tied for 3rd on the team in picks. One can imagine him willing this team to more wins should they play more this season. Andre Romaine was also very impactful in pass defense game last season with a solid 5 interceptions and 6 pass deflections. Look, if you're Gateway here, obviously these past 2 fall seasons have not been very kind to you, so you would imagine that you can only go up from here. But they do start off on the road against Northridge, which is a 3A squad here. I think that, Northridge is graduating a ton of talent, but we'll see if Niall Sorrell is enough to basically overpower, the discipline and, kind of the prestige that they've built up there. North Glen, I don't think that they win this game. Far Northeast, not as familiar with, but I know that they graduated a handful last year, so I think that this can come down. This is a winnable game for Gateway, I would say. I'm not going to call it a win, but it's a winnable game. I'd say the same with Liberty and Thornton. They can't beat Widefield. I don't think that they beat Denver South. They could beat Hinckley or Palmer. I don't think that they beat Centaurus. So, talking like that gives them, on the low end of things, games that they should win are at least Hinckley and Palmer, in my opinion. And, at the high end, maybe beat Thornton and then a Liberty or Far Northeast. I don't think both. So I'd say a window of wins. I really hope I don't regret this year, Gateway. You gotta meet me halfway here, man. Come on, Niall. I believe in you to win 2 to 4 games for this team. Probably leaning a bit more on the 2 and 8 squad, but I really just want to see this program succeed and kind of flip the script that has them kind of written as the butt of a lot of jokes these past few seasons. Excluding the spring season, of course, where they made it to state, but it has not been sunshine and rainbows since then. And to conclude this episode is a very exciting group. That is the Monarch Coyotes, who did make the postseason last year. And, they did have a pretty tough start to the year, losing to Stanley Lake and Frederick before bouncing back, evening their record. And it was just kind of give and take here this season, winning 2 games to bounce it out to 2-2, losing a game, winning a game, then losing 2 in a row, then winning 2 in a row to close their season and make the postseason here. Included in that was a very tough loss to Longmont by only 2 points that Gideon was actually able to see, as one of his, trips back from FOCO. So shout out to Gideon for going and checking that out. A 1-point loss to Frederick. So, there's certain plays that kind of change the trajectory of what this season looks like for Monarch. And then, they do make the playoffs at 5-5 and lose to Mesa Ridge in the opening round. But I think that the ceiling is a lot higher this year, and I'm also going to put pressure on them and say that the floor is a lot higher this year. And let's talk about some reasons why, but only after talking about the paying homage, I should say, to the class of 2023 that made this playoff trip even possible. They are losing leading rusher Aiden Murray, who, had a 116 carry, 733 yard, and 5 rushing touchdown season that provided some balance to this offense that really aired it out. Shout out to Monarch for advancing to the modern age here, and we'll talk about reasons why. But, 2 senior receivers really made an impact for the Coyotes this past year. Fox Reichert almost reached 600 yards and had 4 scores, while Griffin Weber led the team in all receiving scores with 7. Griffin also had a very nice season on the defensive side of the ball, leading the team in tackles with 69, nice, and recording 7 tackles for loss along with 2 interceptions, doing whatever this defense really needed from him. Dominic Gendrau was another guy who had an interception and returned it for 42 yards and another 4 pass deflections to pile on top of that, being an impact player against opposing quarterbacks. William Kibe led the team in sacks with 3 sacks in just 6 games and led the team with 2 forced fumbles and 2 fumble recoveries to complement his 1 blocked punt as well. So you have a lot of kind of moving puzzle pieces that impact the game in a lot of different ways on this defense and special teams, and that is further, proven by Trace McMahon, Aiden Murray, and Max Liu, who all had over 40 tackles and a collective 7 tackles for loss, and make up for 3 of the top 7 senior tacklers on this Coyote defense. So lots of defensive pieces moving, a couple of skill position guys, Aiden Murray being probably the biggest impact, and then, Fox and Griffin also graduating. That's a lot of talent to be losing. So why am I so confident in this season? Well, let's talk about some of the guys that are coming back. I think that Rex Muldoon was Tyrannosaurus in his defensive efforts, leading the team in tackles for loss with 9, and then having 56 total tackles, and is a breath of relief for this defense that graduates so many players on that side of the ball. And you got to take into the fact that he also tied for the most sacks at 3, and you have a reliable presence in the front 7 from last year. He also returned back Lucas Holmberg, who is surprisingly tied for 4th on the team with 4 tackles for loss, despite not having the most tackles on an individual level. Owen Mellish nearly reached 1,000 receiving yards on 49 receptions and scored 5 times. So despite graduating those 2 other seniors, you still have a receiving threat on this Coyote squad, which is important because Asher Ewing did the most last season, rushing for a decent 316 yards, but also opening up this Coyote offense like we hadn't seen with 2,341 yards and 19 scores, which was good enough for 6th in the state yards-wise. And, with enough touch to give his guys chances to make plays on the ball and arm strength to stretch the field, he has been a game changer and maybe even a program changer, using his eyes to open up receivers and showing comfort in the pocket. But his turnovers will have to be reduced. I don't think that he has the best velocity watching through his film on kind of those intermediate routes. So that will have to be worked on, especially for a team that I think can really take a step forward next year. They got their quarterback, they got their wide receiver, and they have some guys on defense that made plays. They will be seeking ways to stay balanced here. But, look, they should beat Boulder. I think they should beat Stanley Lake this year. They should probably beat Frederick this year. That one, I'll call it a coin toss. They should beat Centaurus. I think that their first true loss could probably come against Pooter here, but I think that they should close the gap way more this year than they had last year. Pueblo South, that team was on the struggle bus last year, so it's hard to give them a vote of confidence heading into this season. I don't think that they beat Erie. They should avenge their loss against Longmont last year. This is at home for them. This is a chance to, pull that back. And then Greeley West, and then Silver Creek. Silver Creek, that might actually be one of the best games for, maybe deciding who gets into the playoffs or like very heavy seeding implications and stuff like that. I think at worst, you lose to Erie, you lose to Longmont, you lose to Pooter, and you lose to Silver Creek. I think that should probably be your worst case scenario. So I think that you should win at least 6 games if you're here as Monarch. You should improve from last year, turn one of those losses into a win. And then I think best case scenario, you only lose to Erie and then only one of the Longmont teams. So I'm going to say a window of wins of 6 to 8. I am probably leaning on the 7-3 or 6-4 side of things, but I do think that if you can only lose to Erie and then only lose to one of, Frederick, Longmont, or Silver Creek, that's a great season. That's a great season. I think that's a respectable season and one that might even earn you a bye for this next year. And, Asher Ewing, after watching his film, he is on our radar to be in that discussion for top 5 senior quarterbacks, but it's going to start with winning football games and, putting this team in positions to win. And I think that with the defense taking a little bit of potentially a step back from last year, there's going to be plenty of opportunities to show that you can be the reason that your team wins. And that's going to be the onus here on Asher Ewing heading into this season. And that, folks, is going to do it for this episode of Playmakers Corner, where I have reviewed, in this order, Heritage, Broomfield, Adams City, Aurora Central, Erie, Greeley West, Silver Creek, Centaurus, Gateway, and Monarch. I think that this Northern League here, this 4A League 2, is going to be very interesting, with Erie being, the state contender that it is, Longmont returning the players that they are, Silver Creek returning the players that they are, and Monarch. I think that this is going to be a very intense league to play in, so I can't wait to see what all happens here, and I'm very excited to kind of keep my eyes on that. And I'm very excited to talk about some of the other teams that we have coming up that I will continue to preview, and I have been absolutely honored to talk about the teams that I have talked about so far. This is the 4th episode in our season preview series, so go ahead and check out the other 3 that mainly discuss 5A teams along with some 4A Jeffco teams and then some 3A Jeffco and Thornton-ish teams. And, stay tuned for future episodes that will be released on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or basically anywhere that you listen to podcasts. And go ahead and follow, like, and change with your notifications to get notified by those specific apps when our episodes come out. Or you can go ahead and subscribe to us on YouTube, where these episodes also are. And, if that seems like too much of a hassle, or if you want to just dial it up and really be a super fan here because you're so engaged with our content and then interact with other fans, you could do that through our social media, whether it's on TikTok at Playmakers Corner, on Twitter at Playmaker Corner, or Facebook and Instagram, where we are on there as Playmakers Corner for both of those. So go ahead and comment your thoughts on my season predictions. Go ahead and call me out for the misses that I had last year. We're keeping track here, and we are going to kind of talk about how we did last season. And, we're looking pretty good, all things considered, for predicting like 200 team schedules. We did a pretty good job on the 1A through 5A level, being mostly accurate and or right on the money a handful of times too. So, just want to put that out there. But go ahead and stay tuned to our socials, Playmakers Corner, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, for all of those. And go ahead and comment if you agree with our season, or go ahead and share if you think that it's going to be a different story than the one that I've prescribed for you here. All of that being said, I've been your host for this episode, Kodey Stoffer, and I will be hearing from you, or more like you'll be hearing from me, on Wednesday.